What's up? This case is my final one before Christmas. After this is over, I'm taking some well-deserved rest. I've already cleared it with the brass. They didn't seem to be fussed, to be honest. I can't bloody wait. I'm gonna kick back, feet up, warming my cockles by an open fire, eating chestnuts, and weathering out the winter in comfort. But first, I've got this riddle to figure out. What riddle? Well, that would be the riddle of what creature is causing havoc around the loch, of course. Oh yeah, I'm in jolly old Scotland, at Loch Ness. It's the end of November, and yes, I'm freezing my plums off out here. It's icy everywhere. No snow as of yet, but it's only my third day. It is really cold though, like being in a freezer, seriously. The ground is as solid as concrete, and the loch water is like slush. Okay, so you're probably thinking, he's at Loch Ness, it's obviously Nessie he's chasing, am I right? Well, no, that wouldn't appear to be the case. Look, I know people have heard stories about the Loch Ness monster, and the majority of people are right to think it's a remnant dinosaur. The flippers, the bulbous body, and the long neck all scream sauropod, which it basically is. And it's a big but, there isn't just one Nessie. In fact, there's a bunch of them. And they're not just in Loch Ness either. They're all around the world, from England to Australia. So why don't we see them? I hear you scoff. If they are all around the planet in such numbers, why don't we know about it? Surely the governments of the world can't keep that a secret. Well, that is very true. They couldn't. But they don't need to. Can you imagine what would happen if they tried to contain these things? They are some of the biggest creatures to ever exist. They've chewed up subs and sunk ships. But they don't try, and why? Because they aren't that dangerous, really. Unless they feel threatened, they just leave people alone. They eat sharks, whales, and squid, stuff like that. A human wouldn't even be a snack. And why don't we see them? That's because they are deep-sea creatures. Most of their lives are spent way out in the oceans of the world. They come inland to raise their young, that is all. They use the underground waterways and river systems as nurseries for their young. There are about 40 underground inlets feeding Loch Ness alone. In other words, they don't want to be seen by people. Actually, most Nessie sightings are of youngsters. An adult sauropod would be hard to miss, even in a loch the size of Loch Ness. Anyway, that was of no consequence. I wasn't looking to bag a Nessie. I was looking for something smaller and more vicious, or maybe several things. I'd love to catch a glimpse of one while I was here, but Nessie wasn't on my hit list this time. Honestly, I'm not going to lie. I'm not even sure what we're looking for actually. It could be a kelpie, a rogue merman, or even a dobheart shoe, or possibly all of them in separate encounters. It might not even be any of them. I just don't know. I'm leaning towards it being something new, but like I said, no clues here. Rory thinks it's a thunderbird, even though they aren't native here, just because his friend swears she saw a giant bird near the loch last year. Alistair is adamant it's a Nessie, but he just hates the creatures. One toppled his boat back in '98, killing half his crew, he says. He walks with a limp still that he acquired in the incident. Alistair and Rory are the crew of the boat that's ferrying me around for this case, with Alistair as the captain. He is a stern, elderly man in his 60s, with long gray hair and a full mustache and beard. Rory is a younger guy in his late 20s, with dark hair. He's quiet but witty. I mostly deal with him as I can't understand half of what Alistair is saying. His accent is so strong. I don't think he understands me much either, so it works for both of us. But poor Rory is the go-between. I don't think Rory is actually Scottish. He has an accent, but not sure from where. I haven't asked. So what's been going on? A ton of attacks. That's what's been going on. Something, or things, have been snacking on local animals all around the loch area for months, and now it's gotten a taste for people. The loch is not exactly a hotbed for monster activity. Possibly the sauropods keep them in check. I don't know, but there's far more activity in other parts of the country. However, there have been more than 30 cases of missing and mutilated animals around the loch area going back until the beginning of last spring, with 3/4 of them just disappearing altogether. The rest were found torn open and eaten from the inside out. Some of them were found in the water, floating along or washed up on the shore. Some, just lying in the fields where they were culled, their bloody carcasses open on a patch of crimson grass. It was a grim scene. Some wounds looked like sharp fang teeth marks. Some like a huge beak had pecked at the victim, and some were like claw scratches of upwards of 3 inches in length. It had us stumped, that's for sure. What creature has claws, teeth, and a beak? I couldn't find a worthy culprit in the manual, but I was just half browsing with Rory when I was looking. Some of the bodies were less eaten than others. Those gave better results. That's how they discovered the marks, because the remains of the others were mostly gone, stripped to the bone. When I first got here, the guys took me all around the loch and down the River Ness, tracking down all the latest sites so I could check them out. I found nothing useful except that its hunting grounds were a vast area that only something semi-aquatic or capable of flying could possibly cover. We'd been scooting around that loch for days, only leaving the boat to check locations and to sleep. The longer I spent listening to Rory's theories, the more I was starting to think it was a bird of some kind. Maybe not like the humongous eagle he says his friend saw, but still. The beak, the distance across water, the fact it hunted all angles of the loch. A bird could easily achieve that. But what bird? It would have to be a damn big bird clearly, but there aren't any big birds in Scotland, as far as I know. No thunderbirds or raptor birds in this country. No griffin or anything like that could do that. They're too big to pick out the insides of a sheep without destroying it completely. I'd say it could be a bald eagle, but then they don't have any teeth. The rest of the details would fit the description though. So, what is it? A bald eagle-sized bird with teeth. Or maybe it's not even a bird at all. It's doing my head in debating this feckin' question, I know that much. Those two giving me their theories 5 times daily isn't helping. It's mostly Rory-like. And the steady rock of this bloody boat is driving me crazy as well. We just sit out on the water all day waiting for someone to call with an update on a new sighting, or if I figure something out, which hasn't been much up till now. The first 2 days weren't too bad. We were traveling all over to locations looking at possible den spots and likely feeding grounds. But now we're doing nothing but floating. It's day 4, and I've been sitting in the cabin all morning. Rory's fishing up on deck. God knows what Alistair's doing. I'm just bored as hell. So, I'm going to take a closer look at the manual, see if I can't find me a culprit. After scrutinizing the whole Scottish section of the UK manual, I came across this thing called a Boobrie bird. It isn't, however, an actual bird but a shape-shifting entity that resides on the western coast of Scotland. It's a rare one. Not too many reports have been issued about this thing. Its description is confusing, actually. The creatures that it appears as are mostly mistakable for other cryptids. So its main transformation is a humongous penguin, ranging from 3 to 20 feet apparently, resembling a great auk, and that's its most recognizable form. Other forms include a water horse, much like a kelpie, a water bull that could easily be mistaken for a dobharchu, or a large parasitic insect that sucks the blood of horses. Now, the manual says nothing about weaknesses or how to approach finding one of these birds. It just says it is semi-aquatic and labels the entire west side of the country as possible territory areas. It doesn't narrow my search down much at all, but at least I have a suspect now. If this is our culprit, then we need to be looking in the water for it. Its transformations are mostly water-dwelling, so I'm pretty sure it's going to be spending most of its time in the drink. We're going to have to start looking below instead of above. Rory is going to be disappointed. Fishing will be off the table. The only thing we're going to be dunking in the loch now is sonar equipment. I know Alistair has some. He already asked if I wanted it set up, but we've had no use for it yet. It's going to come in handy now though, I reckon. So I went and informed the lads of my discovery and had Alistair set up his sonar. We dunked it over the side, and now we're trailing it around the loch looking for any large signals in the depths. The captain is watching the scanner. I'm sure he's looking for Nessies, but I don't really care about his dinosaur fetish as long as he informs me of anything he finds. I'm just going to kick back and wait. There's nothing else to do. So I went up on deck and found Rory sitting and staring up into the sky. I took a seat beside him as he passed me a warm mug of tea. "What's up, mate?"
All right, Mally, how's the search going?
I took a sip of this very potent bergamot tea, which warmed my insides nicely. "Still nothing." "You still thinking it's a bird?" He gazed back up.
I don't know, pal. I'm just cloud gazing. Bored out of my mind, aren't I?
"Same here," I replied, sitting back.
Lovely view though, right?
"Oh, it's beautiful, mate. Not much scenery like this in the States." He smiled without looking.
Did you ever hunt anything like this bird before? A shapeshifter, I mean?
"Oh yeah," I answered. "I've hunted a few shapeshifters. Skinwalkers mostly. They're pretty tough, but I can handle it, don't worry."
Good to hear that. Never seen one myself.
Rory stood up and gathered his things.
I'm going for a kip, pal. Watching clouds roll by made me sleepy. I'll see you in a bit.
"All right, mate. See you later," I called after him as he went inside. I sat for ages looking out across the water expanse, scoping out the banks when we drew near. The day faded to twilight, so we started heading back. We were about a half-kilometer from a Lister's docking place, which is just outside this little town on the east bank, when a Lister picked up some blips on the sonar. All we heard was him shouting excitedly from inside the cabin. Rory and I were both on deck, getting ready to dock when we arrived, when he just started shouting from inside. We both rushed into the cabin and found him pointing at a cluster of blips moving fast in the same direction, and laughing so hard that he broke into a cough that took his breath away. He said one word as he staggered out of the cabin, choking on phlegm.
Nessies.
I looked at the sonar screen. There were a dozen or so blips, half of which were at least 40 to 50 meters long if my knowledge holds. I'm no expert, but I've had a little bit of experience with underwater tracking. The rest of the blips were around half that length or less, the smallest being about 10 meters. Rory said, looking over my shoulder.
Holy cow, those things are huge.
I ran back outside, looking out across the water. All I could hear was a Lister's coughing as he caught his breath, but the loch was perfectly still. There was no sign at all of the dozen or so 50-meter-long dinosaurs swimming below the surface. I went back inside and watched the blips pass.
Wow, so those were Nessies. They're humongous,
said Finn, leaning against the desk. Yep, I replied, somewhat less excited than those two. I didn't actually see a Nessie. That would have been cool, but it was just a radar blip, and that wasn't what we were looking for anyway. I'd have much rather seen one, even just from afar, or it'd have been these Boobrie. Then at least it would have been a useful find. This was intriguing, yes, but not useful in the slightest. Anyway, after that, a Lister came back and tried to catch up to them, but they clearly swam faster than his boat moved. We went almost a mile past the village and didn't catch up, so we returned, with a Lister babbling on about it still when I left him. That night, there was another attack. At least we think it was that night. The farmer whose sheep was taken hadn't counted his flock in weeks. It was found that morning, though, floating alongside the bank, way over on the southwest shore. That was miles away from where a Lister's boat was, but we loaded up and went straight over, arriving around 11 a.m. The sheep's remains were floating only due to its being the largest mass on the carcass. As with the others, its insides were devoured to almost clean bone from the inside out. No head or limbs, just the woolly center with bones clinging to it. It wasn't much to go on. You probably wouldn't even know what it had been if not for all the wool. But the fact it was here was significant. Every other floating remains had been in the southern section of the loch. To me, that narrows down the search area. Some inland bodies were to the north, but all water finds have been to the south. I doubt this Boobrie is going to drag its leftovers miles to dump them, so I'm guessing its place of residence is going to be in the southern section of the loch. With that information, We started scouring the southernmost part, both with sonar and with our eyes, scouting out any areas that could house a couple of giant penguins. There was this small waterfall inlet that ran through this rather rocky area, and a few hillside areas with small bays leading off the main loch. I checked them out while those two stayed on the boat. I just rowed over and took a look. The waterfall spot looked the most inviting, but I couldn't see anything there. Then we found something more suitable. An underwater cave along the bank just south of the waterfall. It was just below the surface. We could even see it from above. There could be a cave or something in there with dry land for them to sleep on. I marked the area since we had no diving gear and kept looking. There was a gravelly beach a bit further along. Then we saw nothing suitable except 2 shallows on the east bank. Of course, it could just get in and out anywhere, but as for a den location, nothing we found was better than that cave. Rory volunteered to go check it out. He has diving experience and equipment. However, he's a lot shorter than me, maybe a foot smaller, and his build isn't big, so his wetsuits wouldn't fit me, he said. He told me to leave it with him, so I'll just wait on deck and see what he finds. He won't go during the night, so we will head back in the morning. I can't wait. I hope it's the place. If it isn't, I don't know where they're hiding. If not here, I think we might have to get a few more teams in to cover the whole southern loch. It's far too big for just us to cover. We could be here for years and not come across them. A full day's sonar mapping covered just over 2% of the loch's southern expanse. That's how big it is, not to mention deep. The loch's average depth is 132 meters, and its maximum depth is 227 meters. The waters are dark and murky, so can you imagine how hard it would be to find something 10 feet long? It could be meters away, and you'd never know. So we went back the next day, and Rory suited up. He's no coward, I'll give him that. You could see he was worried it might be full of killer penguins, but he didn't hesitate to go down. We watched him descend and go straight into the cave. About a minute later, he resurfaced.
Mally, you have to see this.
See what?
What's in this cave?
I don't have a tank, I said, confused. He smirked.
Oh, you won't need one of those.
Intrigued, I climbed down and entered the freezing cold water fully clothed.
Now, hold your breath. It's not far.
Then Finn went under. I took a deep breath and followed. The water was murky even at the surface. All I could see were shadows and roots sticking out as we entered. I pushed through the darkness, following Rory's feet, and then I broke the surface. The water quickly shallowed out to a barely ankle-deep slush of icy muck. Roots from some trees on the surface poked out of the cave's roof, dipping into the water like spider legs all around us. It was pitch black besides Rory's flashlight. He began pointing out what he could see, as if I couldn't also see them.
Can you see? There are 3 separate tunnels leading off from here, 2 smaller ones and this larger tunnel.
I could see the larger one immediately. It was right in front of him and hard to miss. The thing was easily 6 feet wide, and most of the roots hanging down looked chewed off by something with huge fangs. It looked flooded with water a few feet into the tunnel as well. The 2 smaller tunnels were less than 3 feet wide and totally overgrown with roots. They also looked partially chewed, but by smaller creatures. There was a steady dripping coming from both of the smaller tunnels, but the largest was eerily still and silent.
Now, I don't want to alarm you or anything, Mally, but when I first came in here, I heard something moving down that smaller tunnel to the left. That's why I came straight back out.
Oh, really? I said, getting closer to the tunnel he was pointing at. I listened into it, but I could hear nothing but the dripping water. However, I could feel a light breeze coming down the tunnel. I tried to pull myself into the gap to see if I could see daylight, but it was too small for me to fit in.
Do you hear anything in there?
Just the water dripping, mate. I can feel a breeze, though. It must go all the way up to the surface. I quickly checked the other smaller tunnel. It was the same. I'm guessing these 2 are exits to the surface. We both stood in front of the largest tunnel entrance. No breeze or dripping was coming from that way.
And in there.
Questioned Rory. Well, my guess is it goes deeper, maybe back underwater.
You think those things are in here then?
Could be, but if so, they're not at home right now.
Alright, well that's as far as I'm going, mate.
Said Rory, backtracking to the way we came in. I was about to follow him when a huge bubble surfaced behind me in the flooded tunnel, popping loud enough to make us both jump. We spun to see several more bubbles rising from the water. Rory didn't waste a second. He was under and gone from sight before I could make it to the icy water. I had no guns on me at all, so I didn't wait to see what it was either. I just followed him out as fast as I could move, surfacing meters from the boat to see Rory climbing hurriedly aboard the vessel and waving for me to hurry up. Alistair was already starting the engine. I swam to the boat and climbed up just in time to see a large shadow, almost twice my length, go underneath and disappear. I ran to the opposite side and looked over, but it was gone.
Did you see that shadow?
I saw it, but it's gone now. I guess we found the right place at least, I replied.
So what's the plan?
The plan is, I'm going ashore to find the other end of those tunnels, mate. And you too. I need you to keep your eyes and sonars peeled for that creature whose shadow we just saw.
Right, O'Malley, I'll let the captain know,
said Rory as he entered the cabin. I quickly got changed into some dry clothes, grabbed my guns and equipment, and boarded the tiny rowboat, now ready to take on anything I found. I sailed to shore, disembarked, and started scouting around for the tunnel's other exits. One was easy enough to find. It was right at the base of a lonely tree's roots, not far from the waterfall. I couldn't see anything from there, and the hole was barely 2 feet wide up top. However, the second was far better concealed. There was a large rock surface, roughly 100 meters in length, making a sort of barricade that blocked all view from the water. Behind was a waterlogged gravel pit of sorts, surrounded by tall shrubs and a few old dead tree trunks. A brook ran through it that met up with and flowed into the other tunnel. I only spotted the tunnel because I saw something move out of the corner of my eye as I was checking out the brook's direction. I didn't see it properly because it disappeared into the tunnel so fast. I went straight over to the hole and peered in with the eagle drawn. I wasn't taking any chances. Whatever it wasn't the same thing that went under the boat. It was far too small, but that didn't mean it wasn't one of these Boobrie birds. According to what the manual said, they range drastically in size. Anyhow, I couldn't see anything in the tunnel, and it was just as small as the other one. I kept scouting around, and not far away from the hole, I found some prints. Lots of prints, actually. Only they didn't look like penguin tracks. More like a dozen snakes had slithered down the slope into the gravelly water. As I was examining them and taking a few photos, I heard this most unusual call coming from the tunnel I'd just left. It was some kind of a bird's cry, but it was so muffled I couldn't make out whether it was underground or underwater. It only called out once, so I couldn't exactly follow it to its source, but I was pretty sure it was coming from back underground in those tunnels. That's when I did something drastic, thinking it might flush them out. It seemed safe enough from the surface, but man was it a bad move. So, I had a handful of nades in my bag. I figured I'd drop one down into the tunnel and blow that exit up. That should force anything inside to flee their underground lair or just blow them up. Either way seemed like a good idea. However, when I pulled the pin and chucked it in, it didn't go more than a few feet before rolling back up to the surface. This caught me off guard, as by no means had I expected the bloody things to be waiting in there to kick the nade back out before it blew. I hadn't run more than a few meters away when I saw it come rolling back out. I had no time to react and was caught in the blast. It wasn't enough to seriously injure me, but I was hurled back several yards into the gravelly slop, dazed and confused. Before I could drag myself up and out of that muck, the pool began to sink, dragging me down with it. I struggled frantically, trying to swim for dry land, but it was like quicksand. The more I struggled, the more I sank. I managed to get close enough to the opposite side of the pool to grab onto a stable boulder sticking up from the rapidly sinking water before it all vanished into a huge pit. That's when I felt them wrapping around my legs. I couldn't see what had a hold of me. I was too busy clinging to the rock so I didn't fall into the pit, but I could feel several worm-like creatures squeezing my calf muscles tighter and tighter by the second. I could feel my legs going numb from lack of blood flow. Then one bit my ankle, and I just lost it then. It was fight or die. I used every ounce of strength I had left to haul myself up onto the boulder and turned to see half a dozen of these strange, foot-long, blood-red worms all over my legs, and one was just dangling from my ankle, getting fatter as it sucked out blood. "Oh, hell no you don't," I screamed, whipping out the stun baton and frying them off me one by one, starting with the chunky one on my ankle. I roared in agony as the electricity passed through those bastards, scorching my skin. I felt every spark, but it worked. One by one, they all fell dead into the pit. Then, the second the last one fell, I scrambled up and away from the hole. By then, I was starting to feel nauseous and disoriented, and that's when that weird bird called out again. Only this time, it was louder, less muffled, and coming from inside the huge pit. I took one last look into that hole before staggering back to my rowboat, and what I saw, or I think I saw, I can't be exactly sure because I was dizzy as a bat at that point, but I think there was a penguin the size of a grizzly in the hole looking up at me with bloodshot eyes, bearing a beak full of razor-sharp gnashes. I didn't stick around. I had to get help as soon as possible. That worm's bite was full of toxins that were rapidly shutting down my senses. I made it into the boat with a flop, barely able to even see at that point, and drifted out into the loch as I blacked out. I vaguely remember hearing Rory's voice calling my name, but then nothing. I awoke 3 days later in one of the company's medic bays, in intensive care, my head pounding like a big bass drum and hooked up to so many monitoring machines that I thought I was dead. All I could remember was the horrible nightmare visions of those worms sucking me dry and then being picked apart by that giant penguin. I woke up screaming hysterically and had to be put under sedatives for the entire first day until I finally awoke calmer, realizing I was still alive. Rory and Alistair heard the explosion and then saw my boat floating out from the bank. They picked me up, not knowing what the hell had happened, and realizing I was in a bad way, rushed me straight to shore where the company had medics waiting for me. It took them 2 days to figure out what toxins were affecting me, and then they pumped me full of antitoxins to counter its effects. Thank God it worked, or I would have been a goner that day. Almost a week later, they released me from hospital as my nervous system had finally stopped shaking and my blood tests came back clean. Straight away, I packed my gear and set out with one thing on my mind: revenge. I wasn't going in half-cocked this time. The location had been investigated while I had been in recovery, and they found those dead worms that infected me. That's how they figured out the toxins. They were still running tests on the carcass, but that was all they found in that pit. However, I was pretty sure they would still be in the area. There wouldn't be much point in them fleeing their lair, if that was their lair, since they weren't found. So, I went back, alone this time, but well prepared. I got my hands on 5 charges of C4 and a spare shot of the antitoxins they gave me, just in case I met with any more of those worms. I had all my usual weaponry, fully loaded. Then, I had a company chopper drop me close to the waterfall. I planned to just blow up that entire tunnel system and see what happened. If the collapse did the job, that would be amazing, but I wasn't holding my breath that it would be that easy. The brass thought I'd gone nuts when I refused to go home, but I couldn't just leave it at that after they almost killed me. So back I went. The pit had almost filled with water, which had frozen over by then. It was the first week of December. Snow was falling heavily in huge flakes, making the landscape a milky white. It looked really Christmassy around the loch, making me determined to get this done and get home. I arrived around 2 p.m. and set my plan straight into action. I placed a charge at the tree base where the small tunnel exit was located, 3 more around the frozen pit, evenly spaced to cause as much damage as possible, and the last one I set up right above the underwater entrance that Rory and I had used to get inside. I wasn't going in there again, not after last time, so I decided to just blow the top and hope it would be enough to crumble the tunnel. Once everything was in place, I retreated to a safe distance at the top of the waterfall and let it blow. It was crazy, honestly. I hadn't expected their lair to be that big. Now, when you set off multiple explosions around a small area that you know has tunnels underneath, you kind of expect the ground to rumble. But when I popped those charges, it felt like an earthquake had just begun. The blast fired off simultaneously, and within moments of hitting the fuse, I was having to steady myself on a rock so I wasn't shaken off my feet. Then the ground started dropping around the pit. First, a trench opened up in between the tree charge and the frozen pit. Then the outskirts of the pit itself fell into the ground. Then all the rocks along the bank, above the underwater entrance, just crumbled into the water. I watched all of this happen, smirking wickedly, but that wasn't all. The trenches just got bigger, cracking the frozen ground. Reaching from the bottom of the waterfall I stood above to way past the pit. Almost all the rocks obscuring sight from the loch crumbled into rubble or just sunk into the water. It shook for a good minute or so before stopping. I gave it a few minutes to settle before taking a close look, but when I went back, it was like someone had just dug a new channel into the loch's bank. The trenches and the now baseball pitch-sized hole were just full of water. No sign that there had ever been solid ground was left. I crept around the edge, and in the pit's center, there was a bunch of dead penguins floating on the surface. They just looked like large penguins anyway, but they were only around 3 feet or so. The biggest was about 4 feet, which is damn big for a penguin, but it was nothing like what I saw in the pit the last time I was there. I was being so jumpy because of those friggin' worms, but I didn't see any more of them, dead or otherwise. I sat down by the waterfall when I made my way all the way back to it, and called for a cleanup crew to dispose of the penguin corpses. There were at least half a dozen floating in the pit, and God knows how many more were possibly trapped underwater below the rubble, but I wasn't convinced that big bugger was one of them. While waiting for the cleanup crew, I heard something moving in the water. I couldn't see what it was as the snow had picked up to the point I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I sat by the waterfall, shotgun in hand, listening. Every few minutes, I kept hearing it. A splash, then another moments later, like something was breaking the surface and then resubmerging once more. Each time I jumped up, scouring around the surface of the new channels I'd opened up, but didn't see anything. Then, when I heard it again for maybe the 5th time, I saw the water rippling in the big pool. I walked over to have a closer look and realized all the penguin corpses floating in there were gone. It had to be that big one in there. They were definitely all dead, so there wasn't any chance they got up and swam away. It had taken them. It must have. I'd been wondering if the smaller ones were its offspring, but why would it remove their bodies? Was it eating them? That's pretty sick if that was the case, but who knows? I looked all around the area just in case they'd somehow floated away, but there was nothing to see. So, I ended up standing on the loch's bank, peering out into the half-frozen water expanse as the day grew long. I informed the cleanup crew that they were no longer needed, that the penguin carcasses had somehow vanished, and that I'd get back to them when I found out what had happened to them. But no sooner had I ended the call when something began moving in the water around the loch's entrance to my new channels. I got into cover behind the remnants of the rocks along the shore, and that's when I saw them. At least 3 were swimming a few feet below the surface. I saw only their shapes in the murky depths, but they approached the channel's entrance and swam up it into the huge pool. Then they exited the water on the far side, near where I'd been sitting next to the waterfall. Two came out first, both around 7 feet tall, black and white with little frills on top of their heads. They were exactly like regular penguins, jumping up from the water to land on the banks upright, besides the fact that they were larger than me, obviously. But besides their size, they didn't look any different at first glance. Then they began squabbling, and I could see what else made them different. Their beaks were full of teeth, like a shark's, just a few inches in size, but there were multiple rows of them. Their tongues weren't tongues at all, but reminiscent of those bloody worms, as if they'd eaten one and it had crawled back up to pop out of their mouths. They also had claws like an eagle's on their flipper ends, 3 on each foot. They hopped around for all of a minute, squawking and taking defensive snaps at each other. Then the alpha emerged to stop the quarry. I shit you not, he was easily 10 feet tall. The pool half emptied when he launched from the water, landing with an earth-trembling thud between the other two, and immediately bellowing this ear-busting squawk that stopped their squabbling instantly. Now that they were all here, what was I going to do? I had all 3 of these absolutely massive killer penguins right in front of me, so clearly it was go time. "Oi!" I shouted from my cover as I drew the eagle. They all heard me and turned in my direction. I started firing rapidly, emptying the eagle in seconds and quickly reloading another clip before they even knew what the hell was going on. I got at least 2 hits on one of the smaller ones. I saw it stagger as I reloaded, but then both of them slipped straight into the water, leaving the big guy up top alone. He started waddling around the pool towards me, going seriously fast for something so robust. I emptied the next clip at him, hitting him in the chest with every round, but he just grunted and kept coming as if he hadn't felt it one bit. So I pulled out Remy and emptied her into this advancing behemoth, now closing in on my position, every shell tearing chunks of flesh and feathers from its gut. He stumbled after 3 shells, his insides starting to spill from the wounds. The 4th forced him to fall on his face, squawking this eerie gurgling noise. He started trying to shuffle into the water. His head was just feet from me on the ground, so I stepped forward and popped open his scalp with the last shell just as it went in the drink, spraying brain juice across the surface. Then I backed up behind the rocks, reloading and wondering where those other 2 went. The alpha's body lay still, the remains of its head bobbing around in the water. Then I saw them leave the canal and shoot off into the loch like 2 torpedoes, dropping from sight in an instant. I waited almost 10 minutes, gripping Remy close, shivering like a leaf in the snow, but they didn't return. Then, when I finally relaxed, I called back the cleanup crew, advising them of the rather large penguin's corpse I had at my feet that needed removal. They came, picked it up, and dropped me off back at the facility. I had a lengthy discussion with my contact about these Boobrie birds. They didn't know too much about them, but from our deductions, we established there must have been some kind of a family pack living in those tunnels. God knows how deep they went. I never went into the water after blowing the place up, but they had to be fairly big considering the canal that I left behind. Supposedly, they are shapeshifters. I never saw them transforming, but the fact that their tongues looked just like those worms implies they either changed to or from them into the birds. They truly are some strange creatures, but that was it for me. My work here was done. Their lair was found and destroyed. The majority of them were exterminated, including the alpha, and those other 2. Well, they were never found, but no more animals were mutilated or taken after that, so they clearly vacated the loch. It was of no consequence anyway. My job was done, and it was time to head home to start my winter vacation. I couldn't wait, so after a quick farewell to the lads and a few festive beers, I jumped on the plane back to the States. I hope the festive cheer is heading to everyone very soon if it's not already with yous. I'm hoping to have a quiet, cozy one this year. A bit of snow coming my way wouldn't go amiss. Or maybe I'll pop up to my Alaskan cabin. Plenty of snow there. But I'm not sure if that's a good idea. I always seem to end up in a pickle up there. I'll just have to see. Anyway, that's it from me. I hope you all have a lovely holiday season this year. Please share some festive cheer with me, and come back next time to see what I'll be doing next year. Until then, Merry Christmas, everyone.